Welcome to RFA Convention 2025, where we celebrate trucking.
Good morning, Gavin and the RFA board and distinguished attendees. That's the rest of you guys. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm going to stress invitation now because, as you know, and it was referenced a little bit earlier, the president was invited to the White House, and look what happened to him. So, Gavin, no videos, please. I tried another way to kind of get everybody at ease, and I thought, well, let me go through that tried and traditional. Well, I'll imagine everybody naked in the room, but that's kind of the stuff of nightmares, so I'm moving on from that. So I basically boiled it down to, I'm here in peace, I come in peace, I come as a rail person, I come in peace, but I also come with my checked shirt. So thank you very much. What I'm going to go through today is, and I'm going to stick to a script, unfortunately, because we are referencing some government partnerships and government structures, and I just need to make sure we get it all right. I'm going to go through the efforts that a number of organizations, bodies, institutions, departments have spent significant effort over the last couple of years to try and restore businesses' faith in rail. I'm going to touch on the National Logistics Crisis Committee, what Transnet is doing, what the Department of Transport is doing, and then sketch a future in a pivoted reality for road transport, and would then pose the question, how do you reimagine yourselves, restructure yourselves, reinvent yourselves? Because we have a government policy now that's come out that says we've got to migrate from road to rail, we've got to deal with a big increase in the volumes on rail, which we'll touch on in a minute, and how do traditional road transporters play in that space? So just quickly moving on to the National Logistics Crisis Committee. This committee was convened in May of 23 by the President. We had lessons learned from the National Energy Crisis Committee, which had started about a year before that, dealing with Eskom and the energy crisis. Established under the auspices of Operation Vulindlela, a really tightly run joint venture between the Presidency and National Treasury. The structure of the engagement with the National Logistics Crisis Committee between business and the government was founded on the successful partnership that had come about under COVID, where Business for South Africa, which you'll see the name at the bottom there, as representing organized business and all interested and affected stakeholders that engaged successfully with the government to deal with the COVID crisis. There's significant business funding that's been provided to the business team engaging with the NLCC, and there's support as well, financial support for the NLCC, for the government structures where they may need catalytic interventions. The important thing about the NLCC, two things: it was to stabilize and improve the performance, if you will, of the industry supply chains, key supply chains in the economy. It dealt with rail, ports, and road. And secondly, and critically, and that's what we're going to really spend some time on today, dealing with the modernization of the freight logistics sector, and particularly the structural reform, significant structural reform that was going to be brought about. All of this was then handled under the NLCC. Now, I must stress at this point, business is not the NLCC. The NLCC is a creature of government. Business is invited into the NLCC to participate in work streams. There's 8 work streams, which are on the slide, on the screen right now. Critical for today's conversation is work stream 1, which deals with the stabilization and improvement of the key supply chains. And you'll see them listed there, where we talk about coal, chrome, manganese, container corridor, magnetite, etc. So really, this was an 80-20 approach, given limited bandwidth when the NLCC was started back in May of 23. Linked with Workstream 1 goes Workstream 7, which is dealing with security. Now, most of you will know, and you've probably also suffered security-related incidents. There was reference earlier to Lowry and the work being done by the RFA and others on security on road, but similarly, obviously, Transnet has been negatively impacted by theft and vandalism. But critically as well, business requested of the NLCC to establish Workstream 2, which is chaired or co-chaired rather by Lazarus Berida, and thank you, Laz, for your support, with Gerard Moret playing a significant role in Workstream 2. Workstream 2 came about because clearly the trucking industry had responded to Transnet's decline in performance, and in order to keep the economy going, had thrown significant effort and resources into moving cargo for business. So business contracts you guys in the room, and therefore business has the responsibility to make sure that in the overall logistics approach under the NLCC, that we improved the transport operations, dealt with border transit, particularly at Lebombo, and then also dealing with the security aspects and congestion. So we took it upon ourselves and we requested, and it was granted that the NLCC then include Workstream 2. But fundamentally, it was always meant to be a short-term intervention that eventually there would be a road-to-rail migration of those cargoes that are rail-friendly and that should be on rail in the long term. Just quickly then moving on to the freight logistics roadmap, which some of you will be aware of. I'm not going to spend any time on this. It was conceived and developed by the Operation Vulindlela in the NLCC. As I said, two takeaways from this. On the right-hand side of the slide, the short term is arrested decline in the performance, which I think we've done, and I'll show you that in a minute, of the key corridors. And the ports, and then secondly, and that's to fundamentally restructure the logistics sector in the country through structural reform. Just touching on the situation before the structural reform took effect, you'll see that there was, this was sort of back before October of last year. There was an oversight function from the government on the South African rail system, with Transnet, this big blue box in the middle, largely dominating the rail space and the logistics space in the country. They owned the infrastructure, they managed the infrastructure, and they provided the operations. The structural reform has started with a view of vertical separation. First of all, DPE, the Department of Public Enterprises, was done away with last year. So Department of Transport, DOT, is now responsible both as a shareholder of Transnet, it is the shareholder ministry of Transnet, as well as then setting policy and all the things that it used to do for road, rail, air, etc. There's a transport economic regulator that's come into being and a railway safety regulator. There's still oversight from the government in this space, but it is now vertically separated, where you have a Transnet infrastructure manager, TRIM, that is then going to be owning the rail infrastructure and the marshalling yards, ancillarated areas, and significantly will also manage that infrastructure and will be responsible for providing access to the infrastructure. Where the trick comes in and where the fundamental difference is that through the network statement, which is a document and a set of rules that allows for private sector or third-party train operators now to gain access to the network. This is in addition to Transnet Freight Rail, who have been the traditional rail operators. It is envisaged as well, and this, we just bear this in mind, that cargo owners will also be allowed to apply for access to the rail network. Clearly, you would need to be in partnership, if you're a cargo owner, with a approved and accredited certified train operating company, but you yourself as a cargo owner can apply for a slot on the network. And then TRIM, the infrastructure manager, will manage these applications. Currently, you can do it right now. There are applications being adjudicated by TRIM as we speak, with an announcement fairly shortly around which routes private sector operators have applied for, and if they've been successful or not. I'm not envisaging a significant number of applications to be successful. It's going to be a really tough call to get private train operating companies on the lines right now. There are limitations in terms of access to rolling stock and access to locomotives. But there are 5 or 6 or 7 established train operating companies in the country at the moment. Important note for future. However, they've never really run on main lines. They've mainly been involved around marshalling yards and short line operations, so there's a challenge there. But the fact is the government has opened everything, and TRIM and Transnet are now adjudicating, and we will have third-party or private train operating companies on the line. The other significant change has been previously Transnet was responsible for looking at joint ventures, concessions, etc. That has now moved to Department of Transport, and we'll touch on that in a minute, another fundamental change in the structural reform. Just to touch back on the work that Workstream 2 has been doing and why we've been doing it. Clearly, our focus, as some of you will know, has been on the N4, and that's largely because it's been the corridor that's challenged us the most as the NLCC, and through the Komati-Poort Business Chamber, they've probably been the loudest squeaking wheel, if I can coin a phrase. And we've tried to respond, and they've had access all the way up into the NLCC to the government structures, and there has been a focus, and thanks to all the other people in Workstream 2 in industry that has assisted us. The reason we've done it clearly is you needed to keep the economy going. A lot of you have run off to Maputo with the various commodities that couldn't be moved to Richards Bay, or if there were challenges in Richards Bay or pricing changed and made the route to Richards Bay uneconomical or other terminals, there was an influx of vehicles way beyond what we were ever expecting on the route to Maputo. Clearly there's choke points at the border and there's choke points at the harbour itself. Those are the challenges, but I think we've in the main addressed them. It hasn't been easy, but the reason is that while rail was unable to supply the service, and the rail has improved, both to Komati-Poort as well as through to Maputo. We needed to keep an eye on this, but there's been lessons learned. A lot of data has been generated by the exercise, and a lot of processes, and critically, a lot of relationships have been established in dealing with this. And I think, you know, if you look at what happened when there was the Maputo unrest recently, we responded, and I think it was a very successful response in a collaborative manner. So it has been worthwhile, but overarching and really the request from the NLCC is that we need to consider an ultimate road to rail migration. In terms of the partnership, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. A number of projects or initiatives, which you'll see in the bottom at the middle there, have been developed. Number plate recognition, we've involved ourselves and engaged with the PBS guys. We've looked at the Corridor Performance Measurement Index. We've dealt extensively with SARS and the BMA on the border staging and process improvements. And again, good relationships have been established, and I think we're going to see very positive results in terms of buffer areas and staging areas, etc. We've dealt with the CMI, the Corridor Management Institution. We established, with some support from the industry, the Virtual Central Coordination Center. And then critically, there's recently been some good news on the Accountability Index, which is being formally launched on Friday the 30th. And if you don't have an invite, you know, please let us know, let Gerard know. Gerard, good. I think it's being launched with the DOT and the World Bank, and I think it's an exciting development for efficient and effective road transport that can be objectively scored. But let's get to the heart of the matter. So Transnet and its performance. And where we need to go, and why am I here today? So Transnet in 2017-18 did 226 million tons on rail. That's, and just by the way, the containerized traffic or cars or fuel, it's all ultimately reduced to a ton in a calculation. So 226 million tons. It precipitously dropped over 6 to 7 years, down to 150 million tons. Poof, all that cargo gone. Sure, a lot of it went to road, a lot of it was because of economic activity. Last year, or the year just finished in March 25, you'll see Transnet did 160 million tons, way below what the economy needs. The economy needs between 215 to 230 million tons in the growth that we're seeking. The minister has put a very hard target to the rail industry, and I must stress now it's the rail industry, it's not Transnet only, to get to 250 million tons on rail by 2930. That's like around the corner. She's also given passenger rail targets and various port handling targets, but let's focus on the 250 million tons. It's going to come from two places. It's going to come from economic growth. It's going to come from road to rail modal shift. The Economic growth, the business partnership with government, which I've referred to continuously, has an aspirational target of 3% of GDP growth. You will be aware we're working with the government on energy, we're working with the government on crime and corruption, this is now organized business, we're working with the government on employment, and more recently Operation Vulindlela and business has been approached to deal with the water crisis as well as local municipalities and local government, all in the quest to drive economic growth of this aspirational 3%. The 250 million tonnes is there. The rail industry is aware of it. The rail industry is working really hard at it, as is Transnet. As part, at the moment, really, they are the rail industry. Very shortly it will migrate and we'll be able to get third-party operators and private sector participation, but at the moment Transnet is part of it. Where does the 250 million tonnes come from? Early analysis and early work done on it, the 90 million tonnes to go from 160 odd to 250. A lot of it is going to come from general freight. Sure, there will be domestic mining, there will be some pit-to-port stuff, etc., but the bulk of it will be coming from general freight, which really speaks to intermodalism, freight villages, all these kind of things. How are we going to get the cargo from road to rail, and what are the transfer or transition points? So just bear that in mind for the moment. I'm not going to touch on the next slide, which you can have a look at if you get the deck. That's just dealing with the interventions that Business for South Africa has had with the government and through the structure. Critically, DOT, and I must give them credit, the Department of Transport have got some really progressive thinkers in their rail unit. What they've done over the last while is they've spent a ton of money and a ton of time on what's called the National Rail Master Plan, which deals with the future of rail in the country. It's a comprehensive report, a comprehensive research being undertaken. It deals with market demand. It deals with the operational and technical capabilities, the funding of how we're ever going to achieve these volumes on rail. It deals with freight villages. It deals with intermodalism, etc. The report will be out in a couple of weeks, couple of months. Let's put it at months. For public comment, there will be an extended public comment period, and I would urge you all to please get hold of this report. It'll be in draft, and please comment on it. But it is a genuine attempt by the Department of Transport, both as the custodian of transport in the country, but as well as a shareholder of Transnet, to examine the future of rail in the country and how do we get to the 250 million tonnes and beyond on rail. Just a little bit more about the rail reform process. As I mentioned earlier, there are two aspects to rail reform, and we're deep in it right now, and that hence why it's a very contested space. And the business involvement up until now, since May of 23, is reaching a juncture with the government in the partnership. We need to be really careful as business now in a contested space of opportunities that are presenting themselves in third-party access, as well as private sector participation, private sector investment. So, hence my earlier remarks that I need to stick to the script a little bit so that we are not seen to be, we need to stay in our lane as business right now, but we've got to a real good juncture where you can, as an aspirant or an existing train operating company, make applications for slots with cargo owners and go and run your trains on the Transnet network. You can do it today. As I said, the slots are being adjudicated and the rules are there. There is a short warning that the current arrangements that have been issued under the network statement, certain of the players in the market are concerned about the investability of the framework that's been established. Business recognizes that, and Business for South Africa is addressing that with Transnet and the various government structures. But it is so that there have been significant applications for the slots. There's been 98 applications for the slots. On the private sector participation, which is the other angle or the other focus area of private sector interest, is the Department of Transport, DOT, has established what's called the PSP unit, the Private Sector Participation Unit. It's been staffed up by really skilled people, including and being driven by the team, or the lady particularly that handled the energy, the IPP process, which was very successful. So they're really going all out now. And what they're looking at is private sector investment in the key supply chains in the country, but not a simple, well, let's do a terminal, let's do a this, let's do a that. It's looking at an integrated value chain approach around private sector investment to make a significant difference. And interestingly, they've got a request for information out at the moment, which are closing on the 31st of May. That's to get a sense from the market around exactly what the market would like to see in a request for proposal. So requests for proposals across a number of corridors will be coming out in August and September, but informed by this RFI process. So they really have done it well, they've done it properly, and with a lot of thinking. As we move forward in our relationship with the government, and the future of the National Logistics Crisis Committee, business needs to be better organized. We've had a Business for South Africa structure, but as we move into this area now of structural reform, we need to understand what our lane is and how we organize ourselves. So there's a proposal to consider establishing a Council for Transportation and Logistics. It is proposed, but what it deals with is organized business's way of working with the government going forward in whatever structure and format that needs to be. So we are starting to consider aspects of the future involvement as we move in. Transnet stabilizes and improves. Significant private sector comes in the next year or so. And really it's incumbent upon us to look at what we can do in the future. One of the projects we're considering undertaking, if the CTL makes sense, is to look at an integrated or intermodal logistics master plan, which will be driven by work being done by the National Rail Master Plan, and therefore coming out of Workstream 2, as I've been saying all along. How do we deal with intermodalism? How do we deal with the road-to-rail shift? How do we meet the 250 and beyond million tons that the economy needs on rail? As we look to where we're going in the future, just to go back a little bit, so Transnet at one stage, if you will, and we've put the words trusted partner in brackets, but back in 2017-18, Transnet was really pumping. It's 226 million tons. Everything was moving, big volumes of coal, big volumes of chrome, iron ore, magnetite, manganese, etc. Unfortunately, the wheels didn't fall off, but the wheels slowed down and trains didn't run anymore. But there was a subsequent performance dip, as you're all well aware, to 2019, 2020, and beyond. We've turned the corner, I genuinely believe that, and we're on our way. There is a pathway to 250. And therefore, the challenge now to everybody in the room is how do you pivot to this reality? It's not going to happen overnight. But it's a case of, literally, taking arms or taking hands and seeing what can be done in a road and rail solution. And as we said on the slide here, you've got a tremendous relationship, I believe, with your customers, which has been established over the last 6 or 7 years. You've rescued a number of businesses that had no alternative when Transnet's performance started falling through the cracks. But as we look forward, we've got to integrate, we've got to become independent. You've got to make sure that each mode finds its rightful place in the value chain. And we've also got to look at the regional logistics, notwithstanding significant efforts and time being spent on regional rail. It hasn't taken off, and we need to look at that and how we integrate with the region. My last slide is a very busy slide, but we've just tried to pose some thoughts and questions around perhaps in the reinvention or reimagination of what lies ahead. Perhaps we don't talk about train operating companies, we talk about transport operating companies. We talk about your relationship with your customers and the trust that customers have, your ability to integrate, your ability to operate in an intermodal environment. Perhaps your abilities to manage terminals, to load goods, to offload goods, to manage warehouses. These have been done. What I'm telling you is not new. I've even had deep engagements with somebody around how do they become a train operating company in their own right. So the thoughts are already there, and I think everybody in the room, if they haven't thought about it, needs to start thinking. The government and organized business is determined to make sure that we move the modal balance to where it should be, and what should be on rail and what should be on road, and how we take hands together. So I'm not going to give you the answers. We've sketched something here which, when you get the slides, you can have a look at. But this has been in the context of the work we've done to date and where we see rail going in the future. So that is the challenge that I'd like to leave with you, and happy to take any questions. And I see that I've got 40 seconds left. Thank you very much.
All right, Ian, one question has come through, well, a couple of them actually. The first one, what is the time frame for real rail growth?
If I could just, sorry, if I just go back, or let me take this. If you look at this slide, the 25-26 numbers on there, Transnet is aiming, currently, because Transnet's the operator, is aiming at 180 million tonnes for 25-26. That's based on their assumptions and their work. We believe that number should be much higher, but as I mentioned in the presentation, it's going to be really difficult for private sector to add on to that 180 million tonnes within the next year. The constraints in access to locomotives particularly is severe, and you need funding in order to get proper private sector investment into new rolling stock or into new assets and wagons. Transnet is trying to make a plan, for want of a better word. They've got a leasing company that they're establishing, which will be in place by, they're saying September, October, which will put a number of locomotives and wagons into a leasing company that any train operating company can go and lease from this lease co. Unfortunately, they are not putting the latest and greatest, as you can appreciate, their latest and greatest assets into that leasing company. So the very fact that there may be locos and wagons in there, they are probably not commercially viable and are going to take some time to get into operation. I don't think we're going to see a meaningful private sector contribution to this volume for another 9 to 12 months. Transnet had in its plan originally, it was an internal target of around 193 million tonnes. That was actually in the papers. So if you say, well, where's the growth? It should have already been here. In the so-called recovery plan that Transnet had, they were envisaging to be at 193 million tonnes by the year ended March of 25. They only ended up at 161 million tonnes. That's that dark blue box. So the growth is here. It's available. It needs to get onto rail. It's that Transnet is not capable at the moment of getting there, and the private sector needs time to get itself organized to be able to make a difference.
All right.
I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Do you think sufficient private investment and participation will unlock the economic growth and keep the logistics sector free from regulatory intervention to block road transport growth?
Okay. There will be significant investment in rail. I'm absolutely convinced of that. There are volumes that and cargo and commodities that must be on rail that shouldn't be on road. And therefore, it's not a case of blocking. It's a case of each mode finding its rightful place in the value chain, and commercially and economically finding its way or its place in the value chain. What I didn't touch on in any great detail here, but you may have seen on the slides, is that there's a big opportunity for concessioning. So if you look at the iron ore corridor or the coal corridor, those corridors are naturally concessionable, if I can use those words. And with an investment from the private sector supported and backed by the balance sheets of those exporters, the coal exporters on the one hand and the ore and manganese exporters on the other, the concessions are there, the investment will come, and it'll come very quickly into those operations. However, the concessioning, which is under the PSP banner, is going to take a little bit longer because you need financial closure, legal closure, et cetera, et cetera. It's not as easy as just going to find a set of wagons and locos and putting it on the track. The concessioning is a fundamental shift in the way that that rail is then operated in the country. But I genuinely believe there's no blocking. I've not seen anything, we've not experienced anything that the regulatory environment will block rail. This is more a case of attracting private sector investment into rail, where there's already rail-friendly cargo upwards of already 40 to 50 million tons that should be on rail. And that's simply because that's the economics of it. It's not a case of regulatory blocking.
Right, is the pipeline not part of the road to rail discussion?
Okay, ek weet waarvandaan hierdie vraag kom. Maar in elk geval, ons gaan maar voort. Very much so, and to be honest, there's a lot of confusion and disappointment in the way that the pipeline, the fuel pipelines have been operated and priced. For there to be very auditable proposals, if you will, around how much cheaper it is to move fuel by road rather than the pipeline is very disappointing. We've raised that point with Transnet Pipelines, and there is an ongoing conversation that must be had around what must the pipeline do in the face of this evidence. And it's auditable evidence that it's cheaper and presumably far easier and more efficient to move these volumes by road. And therefore, it's incumbent upon Transnet Pipelines, if it wants to continue to play a role and not end up having spare capacity in the pipeline and more vehicles on the road, for Transnet Pipelines to respond accordingly. So that's my commitment. We've engaged with the TPL guys already, and the next step is a formal presentation of the numbers, the irrefutable numbers, to TPL, and for them to then think about it and respond. But it has been surfaced. Thank you.
One more, perhaps, very typically South African issue, I suppose. It says, with the investment of high-profile politicians on trucks moving coal, do you think rail will ever operate 100% back to normal? Because the guys, need to pay off their loans for their trucks.
I'm pleading the fifth on that. Look, it's an age-old issue. I mean, I was at Eskom for 3 years. I did Eskom's what was supposed to be a road-to-rail migration, and it ended up being a road-to-road migration because of challenges that were in the ownership of the vehicle fleets that Eskom contracted. So I've been through this. I've run around with guards for a year and close protection officers. We don't want to go down that road again. In Workstream 7, of which a number of you in the room have actually participated, in the beginning of Workstream 7, there was a thought that the State Security Agency were going to do a ton of work, and they were then going to prove that trucking companies were responsible for disruption and sabotage of the network. They went and did their work, and in fact, we couldn't even have the road team in the same room as the rail team in the Workstream 7 meetings. They had to be separated because of this perception that there was nefarious activities by you good people in the room and others. And nothing was ever proven. If you look at the disruptions on the network at the moment, I'm not saying there's nothing happening and cable theft or signal cable theft is not occasioned by an aggrieved trucker. But the big disruptions have been proven to be pure criminal activity, derailments, poor maintenance by Transnet, operating inefficiencies by Transnet, etc. But I'm absolutely convinced, and in the time at Eskom, there was a huge question around who actually owned all the fleets. That may well have changed over the years. I don't know. But as far as Workstream 7 is concerned, there's no significant evidence that's proving that's pointing in the direction of any nefarious trucking activity. What I can tell you very quickly, Workstream 7 and Transnet and the big export groupings are intensely focused on security and disruption to the network. And there's a real push for a multifaceted, integrated approach to security now, boots on the ground technology, community, intelligence, access roads, vegetation, target hardening, and really to come up with a comprehensive package, for once and for all, to get rid of the scourge of the cable theft and the vandalism. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Ian.
Good.